The night my sister-in-law handed me a manila envelope across the Thanksgiving dinner table and said, "We had a DNA test done. You should probably see this before we all keep pretending." I was holding a casserole dish with both hands, and there were 16 people watching me. My husband sat at the head of the table. He didn't look surprised. That was the part that broke something in me. Not the envelope. Not my sister-in-law's voice, which had that rehearsed calm people use when they've been waiting a long time to say something. It was the fact that my husband, the man I had been married to for 9 years, the man I had cooked for, cleaned for, quietly rearranged my entire life for, already knew what was inside it. And he had sat down, picked up his napkin, and waited for someone else to hand it to me. I set the casserole dish down. I didn't open the envelope. I looked at my husband and I said, "How long have you known?" He looked at his plate. That was my answer. Let me back up, because the Thanksgiving dinner was not the beginning. The beginning was the day I moved into that house, 9 years earlier, 26 years old, and so relieved to be loved that I didn't stop to ask what kind of love it actually was. My husband, I'll call him my husband because that's what he was, even if it doesn't feel like the right word anymore, came from a family with money. Not the kind of money that's loud about itself, but the quiet, load-bearing kind. The kind that meant his mother had opinions about everything and delivered them in a tone that made you feel crazy for taking offense. His father had passed away when he was in college, and his mother had raised him and his sister alone after that, which she mentioned at every opportunity, usually in the context of explaining why certain sacrifices were expected. I came from a regular family, middle class, Midwestern. Nothing dramatic. My parents were kind people who worked hard and never once asked me to earn my place at the dinner table. I didn't understand, when I married into that house, that some families operate on a completely different system. A system where love is a ledger, where every favor is a deposit and every boundary you try to set is a withdrawal, and the balance is always somehow against you. The first year, I thought it was just an adjustment period. My mother-in-law had strong opinions about how the house should be run, and since we were living in a home she owned, just temporarily, we said, just until we got on our feet, it seemed reasonable to defer to her. I cooked dinner 4 nights a week. I handled the grocery shopping. I kept the house clean because, as she explained once with a small, patient smile, she had a bad back and my husband worked long hours, and someone had to. Someone had to. That phrase became the scaffolding of my life in that house. Someone had to pick up my mother-in-law's dry cleaning, someone had to be home when the repairman came, someone had to organize the holiday dinners, the birthday parties, the Sunday lunches that were mandatory, that were presented as invitations but were actually summons. My husband worked in finance and traveled frequently and was, by family consensus, doing important things. I worked part-time as a graphic designer and worked from home, which apparently translated in everyone else's mind to available. My sister-in-law, she's 4 years younger than my husband, sharp in a way she mostly uses as a weapon, never lifted a finger at any of those gatherings. She would arrive, accept whatever food was on the table, make comments about the seasoning, and spend the rest of the evening on her phone or talking to her mother about people I didn't know. If I asked her to help carry something, there was this pause, this slight theatrical pause, like I had said something in a foreign language. My mother-in-law once told me in what I think she believed was a compliment that I was so capable. She said it the way people say it about a reliable appliance. I want to be honest about something. I let it happen. I know that. I've spent a lot of time in therapy understanding why. The people-pleasing, the fear of being seen as difficult, the very specific anxiety of being an outsider in a close family and needing to prove that you belong. I kept thinking if I did enough, if I was helpful enough and patient enough and undemanding enough, eventually there would be some moment where it all shifted, where they looked at me and saw a person, not a function. That moment never came. What came instead was the envelope. But there's a part of the story that happened before the envelope, and it matters. About 3 years into our marriage, I got pregnant. We had been trying, and I was thrilled, and my husband seemed happy too. Or at least he did the right things, said the right things. His mother was ecstatic. She immediately began talking about the baby as though it were her project. She had opinions about the nursery, about the name, about which pediatrician we should use and which one was, in her words, not worth the copay. I started to feel, for the first time, like my place in the family had been secured, like I had finally done the thing that made me legible to them. I miscarried at 11 weeks. I don't talk about this much, even now, so I'll just say it was devastating, and the way my mother-in-law responded to it was one of the loneliest experiences of my life. She was not unkind, exactly. She sent flowers. She said she was sorry. But within 2 weeks, she was back to planning the next holiday gathering and asking me when I thought we'd try again, and the grief I was carrying seemed to have an expiration date in her mind that I was not aware of. My husband and I never really talked about it. He was raised in a family that moves forward. Sitting with something painful is not part of the vocabulary, so we moved forward. And somewhere in that moving forward, something between us became load-bearing and hollow at the same time. I tried again to build a life that felt like mine. I grew my design business. I made friends outside that family ecosystem. I started saying no to some of the Sunday dinners, which caused a cold front that lasted 3 weeks the first time. I stopped doing my sister-in-law's laundry. Yes, that was a thing that had somehow started happening. I still don't fully understand how, and she responded by telling her mother I had become distant. My husband told me I was making things harder than they needed to be. About 2 years before the Thanksgiving dinner, I started noticing things. Small things, the kind you explain away individually, but which accumulate into a shape you eventually can't ignore. My husband started being protective of his phone in a way he hadn't been before. He started working late in a pattern that felt deliberate rather than circumstantial. He was present in the house but somewhere else in his attention, like a radio that looks switched on but isn't playing anything you can hear. I asked him once directly if something was wrong with us. He said I was stressed and reading into things. He said it in a kind voice that somehow made me feel worse than if he'd been angry. I want to tell you that I confronted it sooner, that I was braver, but I wasn't. I was scared. I had spent 9 years building my life inside this family structure, and I didn't know who I was on the outside of it anymore. So I kept going. I kept cooking the dinners and attending the Sundays and being capable. And then came Thanksgiving. My mother-in-law hosted, as always. I had made 3 dishes from scratch and driven 40 minutes to get there and spent the first hour refilling water glasses and redirecting my mother-in-law when she started monopolizing the conversation about a neighbor's renovation. The table had been set by my sister-in-law, which meant it was actually set beautifully. She has genuine aesthetic talent, I'll give her that. And there were 16 people seated, including cousins I barely knew and an uncle who'd flown in from out of state. I came out of the kitchen, carrying the sweet potato casserole, the one I'd been making for 7 years because my mother-in-law mentioned once that she loved it, and my sister-in-law was already standing, already holding the envelope, already speaking. We had a DNA test done. You should probably see this before we all keep pretending. Silence. The specific kind of silence that means everyone else already knows. I set the casserole down. I looked at my husband. He looked at his plate. "How long have you known?" I said. He didn't answer. I opened the envelope. It was a paternity test for a child who was not mine, not ours, a child I had not known existed until that moment. The test confirmed that my husband was the father. The child was 14 months old. The mother was a woman he had apparently been involved with. The paperwork used the phrase personal relationship for nearly 2 years. I read the document twice. The table was absolutely silent. Someone's fork was resting against the edge of a plate at an angle, and I remember thinking that it was going to fall. Then my mother-in-law said, "We thought you deserved to know from family." I looked at her. "We thought it was better this way," she said, "rather than finding out some other way." I said, "You knew." She didn't deny it. I said, "How long have you known?" She said, "A few months." I stood up. I picked up my purse from the back of my chair, the one I'd hung there when I arrived 2 hours earlier. I said very quietly because I didn't trust my voice to do anything louder. I want everyone to understand something. You all sat down to eat food that I made. You all sat here and watched me serve this dinner and not one person said a word. My sister-in-law started to say something about how it wasn't her place, how she'd been the one to finally... You used this as theater, I said. You could have called me, any of you could have called me. You chose to do it here, in front of everyone, because that's how this family operates. Everything is a performance. I walked out. I drove home. I did not cry until I was in my own driveway, and then I cried for a long time. In the weeks that followed, I learned the shape of the lie I'd been living inside. The woman had reached out to my mother-in-law directly when she discovered she was pregnant. My mother-in-law had apparently helped facilitate some kind of financial arrangement. I found this out later, through a lawyer, and had kept it from me for over a year. My sister-in-law had found out more recently and had apparently pushed for telling me, which I suppose she deserves some credit for, though I have a hard time locating it. My husband asked me to consider his position. He used that phrase. Consider his position. He said he had been afraid to tell me. He said he'd been trying to figure out the right way. He said a lot of things that were true in the way that incomplete truths are true. Technically, carefully designed to produce a specific effect. I filed for divorce 4 months after Thanksgiving. The process was not clean or simple because it never is, but I had spent 9 years becoming very good at managing complicated things, and I managed this one too. I hired a good attorney. I documented everything I could document. The financial arrangement my mother-in-law had funded, money from a joint account my husband and I shared, it turned out became relevant in the settlement. My mother-in-law called me twice during the divorce proceedings. The first time she said she hoped we could handle things with dignity. The second time she said I was breaking up the family. I didn't say much either time. There wasn't much to say that would have mattered to her. What surprised me in the strange archaeology of ending a marriage was what I found when I started looking at who I had been in that house. I found records of the years, essentially the receipts and calendars and photos and messages, and what they showed was a person who had been working constantly and quietly and without acknowledgement, and who had explained that labor to herself in the language of love. That is not love. I know that now. Love does not require you to disappear into function. Love does not treat your capacity as a resource to be managed. I moved into an apartment in February. 2nd floor, good light, small enough that everything in it is something I chose. My mother, when she helped me move in, stood in the middle of the living room and said, "This feels like you." And I started crying because she was right and I hadn't felt like myself in so long I'd forgotten what that felt like. I went back to work full-time. I took on clients I had turned down during the marriage because the timing wasn't right, meaning it complicated logistics that were, structurally, my problem to solve. I made more money in the first 6 months than I had in any full year of my marriage, which is a strange thing to realize. How much of yourself you leave on the table when you're too busy maintaining someone else's household. The settlement included a buyout from the marital home equity. We had eventually purchased the house from my mother-in-law, which meant I had contributed years of my labor to a property that had appreciated significantly. My attorney was very good at math. I used that money to pay off my remaining student loans, put a down payment on a condo I'd been looking at for 3 months, and set aside a fund to finish growing my business. For myself. I used it for myself. I'm saying that clearly because I think it matters. I had given so much for so long to people who never asked whether it cost me anything. Using that settlement to secure my own future was not greed. It was the first time in nearly a decade that I let my own needs sit at the head of the table. My husband and I don't speak now, except through attorneys when there's something procedural to address. The last time I saw him in person was at the final hearing. He looked tired. I felt nothing complicated about that. My mother-in-law sent me a Christmas card. I don't know why. I didn't open it. My sister-in-law texted me once, about 8 months after the divorce was finalized. She said she was sorry for how it happened. She said she should have told me sooner, privately, that she had argued for that and been overruled. I don't know if that's true or not. I replied that I appreciated her saying it, and I meant that, and then I put the phone down and went back to the project I was working on. Here's what I know now, on the other side of it. I spent 9 years being useful to people who mistook my patience for limitlessness. I stayed long past the point when I should have asked harder questions because asking questions felt like threatening the only stability I thought I had. I had so thoroughly convinced myself that being needed was the same thing as being valued that I didn't notice when one had quietly replaced the other. The DNA test, the envelope, the Thanksgiving table. All of that was cruel. The way it was done was cruel, and I won't dress it up. But in the most uncomfortable way, it ended something that should have ended long before then, and the ending gave me back something I hadn't realized I'd lost. I'm 34 now. My condo has a real kitchen, the kind with counter space, and I cook in it because I actually want to. Last month I made a Thanksgiving dinner for 7 people. My parents, 2 friends, a couple from my building who had nowhere to go. I cooked everything myself and I loved every minute of it because every minute of it was a choice. The fork never fell, by the way. I thought about that later. All that silence, all that gravity, and the fork just stayed on the edge of the plate like it had decided to hold on. I think about that sometimes, how much things can hold right up until they don't have to anymore. I used to think the hardest thing about that Thanksgiving was the envelope. Now I think the hardest thing was realizing the envelope didn't actually surprise me. Somewhere underneath all the explaining away and the moving forward, I had known. Not the specifics, not the other woman, not the child, but the shape of it. The way you can feel the load-bearing wall is wrong before anything cracks. That's the thing about consequences. They don't arrive out of nowhere. They accumulate quietly in the choices people make when they believe no one is keeping track. My husband chose to stay silent. His mother chose to manage the situation like a ledger entry. His sister chose a dinner table over a phone call. Each of those choices had a logic to it, a short-term logic, and each of them added weight to something that was always going to eventually give. And my choices had consequences too. I chose to stay when I should have asked harder questions. I chose to interpret exhaustion as love and usefulness as belonging. That's not self-blame. I spent enough time in therapy to know the difference between accountability and cruelty towards yourself. But I think it matters to say it clearly. I participated in my own disappearance, and understanding that was part of finding my way back. What I had to rebuild after I left wasn't just a household or a financial situation, it was my own judgment. I had spent so long deferring to my mother-in-law's opinions, to my husband's timeline, to the family's unspoken rules about what constituted acceptable behavior, that I had genuinely lost confidence in my own read of things. Rebuilding that took time and it took honesty, the kind that's uncomfortable because it doesn't flatter anyone, including yourself. I think about the version of me who moved into that house at 26 so relieved to be chosen. She wasn't naive exactly, she was just operating on incomplete information about what she was worth and what she was allowed to want. The years in that marriage didn't only take from me, they also, slowly, taught me to see clearly. I just wish the lesson had cost less. What I know now is that patience without discernment is just endurance. Showing up consistently, doing the work, being reliable. Those are genuinely good things. But they have to be grounded in an honest understanding of the situation you're in and the people you're with. I had the endurance. I was missing the clarity. The settlement money went toward my condo, my business, my future. I don't feel guilty about that. For a long time, I thought generosity meant giving to others before you gave to yourself. I understand now that there's a version of self-sacrifice that isn't virtue. It's just a habit you develop when you don't believe your own needs are legitimate. Using that money for myself was the first fully clear-eyed decision I had made in years, and it felt like solid ground under my feet. I'm not the same person who carried that casserole dish into the dining room. I'm quieter in some ways, less eager to smooth things over, more willing to let silence be uncomfortable rather than fill it with labor. I ask more questions now. I leave rooms that aren't good for me. I cook dinner because I want to, not because someone's keeping score. The fork stayed on the edge of the plate. That's still the detail I come back to, All that weight, all that held breath. And it just held on. I think you can learn something from that. Not everything that's about to fall actually falls. Sometimes you get to choose when to let go.